And our speaker right now is Antonia Landi. Antonia is a product operations consultant and coach, and one of the top voices in European product operations. She's a firm believer in enabling product organizations to achieve product excellence with the power of product ops, whether as an independent function or a shared responsibility. Antonia has written for publications like Lead Dev, Mind the Product, and Product-Led Alliance, and it's a seasoned conference speaker and panelist directly from Berlin and bringing all the spices from Switzerland and Italy to the stage. Antonia.
Okay, now, hello everyone. How are we all doing today? Oh, come on, I think we can do a little bit better. I know the after party is soon, but how are we all doing today? Yes, all right. Hi, my name is Antonia, and I'm a product operations consultant and coach. And today, we're going to talk about mistakes. Now, having been in product and tech for nearly a decade, I've made my fair share of mistakes, as I'm sure all of you here have too. But in order to show you just how serious I am about sharing even the most painful mistakes with you today, I'm going to start with a pretty personal one. In May 2016, I, together with my husband and our cat, Elizabeth, or Lizzie for short, moved to Berlin. I still remember touching at the small Tegel airport back then, completely emotionally and physically exhausted after traveling with an animal in tow from a tiny, remote Italian village. And I was quite curious and hopeful to see what my new life in the German capital had in store for me. Less than a month later, I made a pretty permanent mistake. Yes, that's my arm. And yes, that's a badly executed version of a tattoo I had been meaning to get for a while. Now, this tattoo was a combination of rash decisions, the sort of politeness you only get from living in Britain for nearly a decade, and a desire to live my new Berlin life to the fullest. And I hated it. You know how people say, if a decision is easily reversible, you should just go for it because you can always walk it back later? Well, this was the exact opposite of that. Not only was it literally permanently etched into my skin, even a possible removal would have been nearly impossible thanks to the thick black lines and the orangey-red color. But this tattoo did do one thing for me, and that's act as a constant reminder that mistakes do happen and that you have to live with them. And over time, it kind of became strangely fitting, because in all of my writing, in all of my speaking, and in all of my consulting and coaching, my directive was always to share the mistakes I had made with you so that you don't have to make them. So without further ado, let's get started. Now, let me see a very quick show of hands. Who here has a product operations title? One person. Excellent. Who is here because they want to know how to get better at product operations? OK, a fair few hands. Good to know. Who is here because they just kind of want to know what product ops is? Right. I thought so. So, the Product Operations Manifesto defines product ops as empowering product organizations to collectively, effectively, and efficiently drive the most meaningful outcomes for customers. Simple, right? OK, maybe not so simple. So let's get very, very concrete for a minute. Now, these are all potentially sets of responsibilities and work items that could fall under what we call product operations. Now, for some of them, we're quite well known by now. Tools and processes, customer feedback and data, these are the things we are starting to associate with product operations as a discipline. But that doesn't make all of the other ones on the board any less important. Now, we might not do all of them at the same time, and some of us might not do some of these at all. And depending on your unique environment, you might be doing things that aren't even here. Product operations creates repeatable systems for high-impact work so that product managers can do their best job. Think of it as running a well-oiled machine, one in which all of the parts just seamlessly fit together. A machine that runs without friction, repeatedly, sustainably, and continuously, and it just gets the job done. Without drama, without frustration, and without the fuss. Product operations empowers organizations to achieve product excellence. And if at this point you're asking yourself what I mean when I say product excellence, it is to collectively, effectively, and efficiently drive the most meaningful outcomes for customers. So, now that we have a shared understanding of what product ops is, let's dive into the first mistake. Because I think it's a mistake a lot of you are doing right this very second. Assuming I wasn't in product operations. Now, you might be sitting here listening to me speak, thinking that while fairly interesting, ultimately my talk is irrelevant to you. You don't have a product ops title, and you kind of just wanted to know what it was all about. Who knows? Maybe the other talks at this time were even less compelling. I don't know. So let me tell you how I got into product operations and why, unbeknownst to even me, it actually started with my very first job. Way back in 2014, I worked for a pretty famous gaming company, Rockstar Games. For about 60 hours a week, I would play and test Grand Theft Auto online. I would play heists, I would compete in races, and together with my team members, I would try to stretch our networking capabilities to the limit. Now, back then, we were testing on multiple different platforms, and we were also testing on what we, back then, called next-generation consoles, so Xbox One and PlayStation 4. But there was a problem with that, because a full player session on these consoles needed 30 people. Now, I was working at the studio in Edinburgh, where I lived, but we didn't have 30 QA people. Neither did our sister QA studio in England, in Lincoln. So what did we do? We got on our internal messaging tool, and we coordinated. We met up in big player sessions and tried to create as much mayhem as possible. Now, an important part of testing, and games testing in particular, is getting session logs. And a log is exactly what it sounds like, right? It's a document that tells you all of the different background processes that are currently going on, any flags that might have been triggered, and if there's a bug, and if you're lucky, you may see a couple of warnings, a couple of errors that might help our developers figure out what is going wrong. Now, as you can imagine, in a 30-player session, these logs are extensive. And let's say I encountered a bug. I would start the log grabbing process, right? Because I needed to sort of request them from the server. And that was fine. But the problem is, if another person 30 seconds later would also encounter a bug, they couldn't grab their logs because my process was still running. So what would they have to do? They would have to figure out who is currently grabbing logs, get in touch with them, and then ask me to share the link to the relevant logs so that they can attach it to their bug ticket as I was doing with mine. I found that completely unacceptable. So I suggested that instead of everybody grabbing their own logs, we simply had one dedicated person who was doing this for all the 30 people in the session. And this person would put these logs with the relevant links and the relevant timestamps on a board so that everybody could just self-serve. Now, of course, at that time, I didn't know this was me devising my first process. But it's exactly this sort of initiative that I took to every other job I had. And this is what made me such a good first QA person for startups, because I could think through the entire system and come up with something that would work for everybody on the team. And this is why this may be such a good PM in companies going through change, through transformation. And it should come as no surprise then that when I read that first fateful product ops job description, I realized I had been doing this my entire life. And the thing is, my story isn't unique. I speak a lot about product ops, and so many PMs come to me after my talks and say, listening to you describe what a product ops manager does, I think I've been doing this my entire time. Now, there's an interesting discussion around the validity of product operations as a discipline going on right this very second, as if we have created brand new tasks out of the blue. Discussing the validity of product operations is a moot point, because product operations exists wherever product exists. And discussing whether we ourselves are or are not in product operations is equally irrelevant. We are all in product ops because we're all in product. And we have a responsibility to set ourselves up for success. Now, whether we do that with an independent function or as individuals, it doesn't matter. Product operations concerns all of us. Now, if you ever have a doubt about whether your company is doing product ops, ask yourself these questions. Who is completing these tasks? It's never nobody. There's always somebody picking up these tasks. More importantly, ask yourself this. Is there something they should be doing instead? Doing product ops as a side job next to your PM job is not inherently a bad thing, unless it comes to the detriment of what you're actually hired for, right? And last but not least, if you don't have the product operational support you need in your company, take up the initiative. Ask yourself, what's the smallest thing I could do today to make my life easier tomorrow? Problem number 2, assuming I knew the problem. Now, don't laugh. I promise this is relevant. OK, what do we know about koalas? They're from Australia. Very good. They eat eucalyptus. Good. They're cute. I love it. So I think as an audience, we might be forgiven to think that we have a pretty good handle on what a koala is. And should push come to shove, and maybe 1 or 2 escaped from the zoo, we might be able to take care of them, right? We know where they come from. We know what they eat. We'll be all right for a couple of days. Now, I'm sure you've heard the expression herding cats. Well, in my very first product ops job, I felt like I was herding koalas. Let me explain. It's true, as you said, that koalas eat eucalyptus. However, most eucalyptus is toxic to most koalas. And the thing is that koalas only ever learn to digest or to handle the eucalyptus that grows within their immediate environment. So if you get a koala from the east coast of Australia and one from the west coast of Australia, to one of them, it's a tasty little treat. To the other one, it's going to put them in hospital. Now, my very first product ops job, I was working at a company that was essentially a collection of loosely related brands, right? They were all doing the same thing. They were all real estate portals in Europe, but they were largely acting completely separate from each other, which meant they were all doing their own discovery, they were all honestly coming to more or less the same conclusions, and they were all building the same thing 4 times. The directive of my team was to help these brands learn to act and live like one company. Back then, as I said, I was in product ops, but I was also the product manager of one of our internal tools. And this tool was essentially a fancy visualization of our user journeys. You could zoom in, you could zoom out, you could see who was involved at any given step, and we even hooked it up to things like a research repository. Now, usage of this tool wasn't as good as we would like it, so as any good product manager would do, I started doing discovery. And I figured out that for some of our PMs, understanding this tool was fairly straightforward. They knew what user journeys were, they broadly had identified the same steps in the same journeys, and it kind of fitted very well into their product development life cycles. To other product teams, it was completely useless. We weren't using the same terms, they were talking about customers in a completely different way, and it would actually take them more time trying to understand this internal tool than they would ever get back from using it. Hence the eucalyptus analogy. Now, it was very interesting to me that even though I had been a product manager, and even though I had been interacting with all of these different product managers, there was still such a massive diversity in how we did product. Sure, I knew we were going through a transformation, and we were really aware of things like company culture, and how people approach different subjects. But the fact that there was such a range in how we actually did product historically was really staggering. So next time you feel like you might be herding koalas, take a moment to remember these things. Number 1, stay curious and don't make assumptions. Interview every person you interview, regardless if it's an internal stakeholder or your customer, with the vigor that you would use if you were interviewing somebody that just stumbled out of a time machine. Number 2, don't rely on your own experience, especially true for product operations managers who used to be PMs. They might be forgiven for thinking, well, I know how hard it is being a PM. I know all the things that suck. I'm just going to fix everything I wish I could have fixed at my previous company. Don't do that. Trust me, it doesn't work. And lastly, remember your product management best practices. What I'm talking about here is simply good problem discovery. And regardless of whether you're applying it to internal or external customers, all the same rules apply. Number 3, assuming a new tool is the answer. So this was the same context, the same company. We are no longer herding koalas. We have moved on to a better place. Now, back then, we had a lovely group CPO who was a huge fan of product ops. We always got along very well. And one day, he came to the product ops team and said, listen, I want you to investigate what the best road mapping tool for our company would be. And maybe a little bit arrogantly, maybe because of the learnings I just told you about, I didn't say, yeah, OK, sure. I said, why? Now, what he didn't know, and what you don't know, is that back then, I had just come off a huge Miro rollout with hundreds of concurrent users who all needed their own license, they all needed their own teams and folders set up, and they all needed to comply with data security regulations that complied with their brand, our group, and our parent company. In short, it was a huge, massive undertaking. And this was a tool we all wanted. Now, it's very interesting that people don't really think all that much goes into getting new tooling, right? They might think, well, we identify a problem, we buy a subscription to a tool that solves that problem, some time passes, and success! We no longer have that problem. Now I'm going to sit here because this is very wordy. Stand, pardon me. Yes. We start out identifying and validating the problem. So far, so good, we're on the same page. But then, we identify and prove or disprove possible solution hypotheses, right? Getting a new tool might just be one of many other possibilities. Once we have identified that the tool really is the right way forward, we might select one based on our criteria and needs. Then, we purchase that tool or the subscription to that tool. We learn about the administration side of things. We set up the tool and share licenses with people that need them. We educate people on how to use the tool. We integrate the tool with our existing tool stack, and then we have to maintain the tool and the information inside of it from now until infinity. Please, before getting a new tool, ask yourself, what options do I have? If I wasn't allowed to purchase a new tool, what would I do instead? And honestly, sometimes the spreadsheet is the better option. Number 2, how can I test this? How can I make sure that the setup is as easy as the salesperson would lead me to believe? Do they have a sandbox environment? Can I get a free trial? How do I make sure that it does actually and honestly connect to our existing tool stack? And last but not least, if I do get a tool, who does what? From education, administration, security, getting a new tool is incredibly time-consuming. Make sure you're not the only one handling all of it. Now, this next mistake is probably one of the hardest lessons I've had to learn. Because no matter with how many good intentions I would show up over and over again, some people just didn't want to hear it. In the second half of the last year, it sometimes felt nearly impossible for me to get my job done, because all of the feedback I would get from my fellow heads of product and heads of engineering was either, I don't have time, this isn't important, or your solution proposal sucks. Now, I would love to stand here and say that this was an absolutely isolated incident. This was a one-off, and nobody else goes through this, and doing product ops is smooth sailing all of the time. Sadly, that's just not true. Because doing product operations, it's not just looking at tool stacks. It's not just looking at process optimization and ways of working. What we're doing is asking people to change. And that change is super hard, especially if you don't believe it's necessary. Now, of course, there are many reasons you might find yourself in such a situation, and we cannot forget to consider that maybe your company doesn't need to focus on product ops right now, or maybe they're just not ready yet. But if coaching product managers and product operations managers has taught me one thing, it's that behaviors rarely just come out of the blue. And over time, I've had to learn that a negative response can mean many different things. No can mean, I'm overwhelmed, and I don't know how to deal with it. let alone deal with whatever you're bringing to my table. It can mean I feel threatened because it feels like you're taking away my autonomy. Or it can simply mean I don't understand. Now, my advice here is simple but difficult. Show up like a human. We get so caught up categorizing our relationships at work that we tend to forget the most important factor in our working relationships. We're all just people trying our best. And sure, some of us might be trying harder than others, but even that has a reason. If you are dealing with excessive negativity, do take a moment and ask yourself these questions. What's the context in which we're operating? What has maybe happened in my life, in my past? What are the experiences that I bring to this table that make me act and behave a certain way? And what has happened to my counterpart that would make them act and behave a certain way? Especially if you're joining a new company, make sure you understand what happened before you joined. Number 2, what worries does this person have? And how can I help alleviate them? And last but not least, if all else fails, ask yourself honestly, what happens if this behavior continues? Now, I've arrived at the final mistake, and this is actually one that I consciously chose to make earlier this year, and one that I will gladly keep on making. Assuming people are ready to have this conversation. When I decided to become a consultant and coach in product operations, I knew it wasn't going to be easy. For years, I had witnessed firsthand the amount of PR and advocacy it takes to get internal teams on board with this concept. Now imagine trying to build my own client base. I was very aware that I would have to spend a good deal of my time speaking about product operations, writing about product operations, and doing product operations well if I ever wanted to have any chance at succeeding. But the thing is, this has never been about money. My mission is to help as many companies as possible achieve product excellence through product operations. Not because I need them as my clients, because I genuinely believe it's the right thing to do. The thing is, this has rarely been easy. From being called process people to being told that my profession simply just doesn't have enough of a correlation to the bottom line, sometimes advocating for product ops can feel like a continuous uphill struggle. Especially at a time where I've seen my peers get let go from their positions, my profession being relegated to being a nice-to-have, our economic climate at the moment just means that people are not willing to invest in something they could arguably do without, even if that something would save them time and money in the long run. So why do I still try to make product ops happen? Why do I stand on stages like these and pour my heart and soul into evangelism? Honestly, I do it for myself. Or I should say my past self. I can't tell you just how many parts of my careers have been intensely frustrating. Not because I hated what I did. I wouldn't want to be in any other space. I love being in product. But because getting work done has never been easy. It doesn't matter whether I was at a 10-person startup, a scale-up, or a large enterprise. There was either too much or not enough process, too many or too few tools, not enough strategic direction, or utter micromanagement. Getting things done never was just right. It never felt easy. This is why I'm committed to helping you avoid the mistakes I make in product operations, to help you become as effective as you have the potential to be, as effective as I never was. Now, I've spoken a lot about mistakes today. Some of them very personal, some of them easily avoidable, and one that I actively choose to make. Now, you might think that focusing on mistakes is overly pessimistic, but I think there's actually great power in not getting things right the first time. Because every time we make a mistake, we learn. There's one final lesson I'd like to leave you with today, and that's that even the pretty permanent mistakes can be turned into something great. Almost exactly 2 years ago, Lizzie here got a redesign and was joined by our 2 other cats in a family portrait I'm now very proud of. Of course, knowing what I know, I still see the old tattoo shine through, but very few other people do. And just like that, my cover-up is just one of very many happy mistakes in my life that I'll happily wear on my sleeve. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you, Antonia.
If you would like to learn more about product operations, please read the Product Operations Manifesto or feel free to subscribe to my newsletter. Thank you.
Wow, nice. Thank you very much, Antonia. We have a few questions. One of them being, can you show your tattoo? But I think that's already covered, right? I mean, literally covered. So, yeah. We would love to hear, if you can also put the questions on the screen. We would love to hear a few tangible examples. What practices and tools do you typically introduce first when you want to show leaders the value of product ops?
Super interesting question. I think there is a big challenge at the moment in product ops in making things tangible in a monetary sense, right? So addressing the first part of the question, one of the first things I actually focus on is communication. It seems like something so basic, but it can really supercharge not only how the product organization connects with each other, but how the rest of the business connects with the product organization. Especially things like making sure commercial teams actually know what's going on. Or things like making sure that in everything we do, every retro, every sprint planning, every piece of your communication, our goals are reflected, right? We are doing this because it will help us achieve that. That is one of the first things I do. Now, showing the value of product operations, I think especially as you're just starting out, is incredibly difficult. What you want, on the one hand, is you want to track the success of individual projects or initiatives, like the communication aspect, but you also want historical data. So the very first thing you should do is create a survey, right? It sounds super simple, but ask the right questions and then see how people feel in 3 months, see how people feel in 6 months. Does sentiment actually get better? Do people feel like they are being more effective? But do supplement that with specific project data as well.
Thank you. Next one is, how can one ensure that great products ops doesn't let PMs and designers off the hook? Let them stop thinking about processes because they know it's being managed.
Interesting. I personally have never encountered this before. If anything, me meddling with stuff will make people pipe up more. Suddenly, people that never cared about how stuff was getting done started having opinions, right? So this is an interesting one. I think there does need to be a shared responsibility because ultimately, sure, I can suggest things, I can train people, I can make sure that we have guidelines and templates, but I can't force people to use those things, right? So it always needs to be a collaboration between your product team and people within product operations to actually make the change happen.
Thank you. A quick one, who are the authors of the Product Ops Manifesto?
There are 12 of us. I am the chief instigator of the project. But yeah, it was a collection of people from all around the world, mainly the Americas and Europe. And we have all been in product ops for eons. And yeah, it's a passion project and one that feels very personal to me as well.
Very good. Can you give an example of a change that you saw as necessary but other team or teams didn't? And how did you overcome it?
Interesting. I think going back to this communication piece, at my last full-time employment job, I saw a very strong need for heavily simplifying our communication. So I joined a product organization. They did have a habit of sharing bi-weekly updates with the rest of the organization, but honestly, even as a product person who's quite comfortable with techie subject, I didn't understand anything, right? But the people that were writing this communication thought, well, it was so simple. They thought that, well, if I leave things out, then how will people know how much great work we do, right? If I'm not detailed enough, then people are just going to get in touch with me and ask for those details later on anyway. That was a tough challenge, and I think actually, instead of saying, we need to change this right now because this, and this, right? What you do is you don't try to sell it as a permanent piece of change. You sell it as an experiment. Hey, we're all product people. Let's test it. Let's see who's right. And ultimately, doing that change actually completely exploded the number of people that started reading our newsletter. And it became very tangible very quickly just how much of a value add that simplification process was.
Thank you so much. I have one last question. What is the impact, if any, that product operations has on product strategy?
Actually, I think it has a huge impact on product strategy. Now, not necessarily in what the strategy will be, but enabling those conversations, right? Like, especially things like quarterly planning processes, like people die every quarter because they have a whole week full of strategy meetings where, okay, we need to socialize this with this person, and then this person needs to give feedback, but now they said something is wrong, so now we need to go back to that other person, and it's just an absolute and utter mess, right? Product operations can make that smooth. It can make it a repeatable process so that you don't despair 4 times a year. What you do is you start looking forward to it. You start having the mental space to ask the questions you need to have. But more importantly, product operations can really, really do a lot in helping product leadership socialize this strategy. Make sure it's in all the relevant places. Make sure people know it's there and they know what it is so that they can take informed decisions.
Thank you so very much. Guys, please join hands for Antonia Landi.
Thank you.